October 3rd, 1943. Camp Hearne, Texas. The sun is high and the dust is thin and yellow in the air when Gefreiter Karl Müller steps from the railcar and into a silence that is full of eyes. He hears the clank of the chains that hold the gate, the soft rattle of canteens, the calling of numbers in English that he only partly understands, and the sharper German words of men keeping rank through habit. He smells creosote in the timber of the fence and fresh bread from a kitchen he cannot see. Two American soldiers stand near the column of prisoners with rifles at their shoulders. Their uniforms are the same shade of olive as the others on the platform. Their boots are the same leather. Their caps sit at the same angle. Their faces are different. These are African American soldiers. One carries a clipboard and reads names with steady care, breaking the syllables of Müller into 3 parts, and then nodding when Karl says yes. The other points with 2 fingers and tells them to move, to keep distance, to hold packs, to line up by 20s. Karl looks once, then looks again, and then looks down because the rhythm of a prisoner is to obey the hand that points and not the thought that wants to argue. He feels a tremor of anger that does not have a clear object. It is anger at being held, at the loss of rank, at the fact that his hands are empty while these men carry rifles. He tells himself that he will pretend not to notice the way his stomach tightens when the black sergeant calls for silence and the entire column obeys in 1 second. Later, at a water tank, he drinks and looks across the yard at the guard tower and thinks that the map of the world in his head has shifted. In Schlesien, he had learned to recite the grades of men. In Africa, he had learned what heat can do to a leg that has marched too long. In Texas, he learns that a man he had been taught to despise can order him to move, and that he moves without speaking. He will write that night in a diary he keeps inside a rolled sock, in pencil that smudges, that the day has left him quieter than any day since capture. Across the United States in the autumn of 1943, the camps are filling with prisoners from North Africa and from the Atlantic. The war has moved to Italy, with the landings at Salerno on September 9th and the fall of Naples in the first week of October. In the same season, freight yards in Virginia and Louisiana send trains west with human cargo, and boxcars with wheat and cotton roll beside them on separate lines. By the end of the war, there will be more than 370,000 German prisoners in the country, held in more than 500 camps across 45 states, with only a few states without a site. The construction time for a standard camp averages about 3 months from survey to first prisoner. A typical compound has wooden barracks with electric lights and stoves, latrines with flush toilets, a hospital ward with an X-ray room, and a mess that can feed thousands, 3 times a day. The Army hands out ration figures that make old farmers blink. Meat is counted by pounds, flour by sacks, milk by gallons, coffee by tins, and the officers in charge plan waste allowances to ensure no man goes hungry. African American soldiers are present in great numbers inside this system. By 1943, more than 500,000 black men wear United States uniforms, and that number will rise toward 1 million by 1945. Many serve in quartermaster and engineer units, in transportation battalions, and in military police companies that guard gates, escort work details, and ride shotgun on trucks that carry prisoners to fields and plants. At the same time, the United States is still a country where segregation is law in much of the South. The War Department is under pressure from the Pittsburgh Courier and other papers that push the Double Va-Vie campaign, Victory Abroad and Victory at Home, after 1942. The President has signed Executive Order 8Y802 in 1941 to bar discrimination in defense industries and has set up a committee to hear complaints. But the Army remains segregated and civilian businesses in many towns still enforce color lines. The result inside the wire is simple to see. The soldier with the rifle holds authority over the prisoner. The result outside the wire is less simple and will take Karl time to understand. The first work detail comes 10 days after arrival. A corporal from the guard company reads 20 names at dawn and calls for men who can lift sacks, count bales, and follow hand signals. A truck with wooden benches pulls up at the inner gate. The driver is a white private who chews gum and never looks back. On the truck are 2 guards from the same company that checked names at the station on the day of arrival. The older one has 3 stripes. He wears a whistle on a cord and carries himself like a man who has learned how to ask for respect and how to hold it. He tells them the simple rules. Do not run. Do not touch the truck tools. Do not leave the field. Drink water often and pull your hats low. The road bumps, then smooths, then bumps again. The fields around the camp open into long rows with cotton that clings in white fists to dry stalks. Farther off, there are warehouses with tin roofs that shine like a river when the sun is high. The truck stops at a cotton gin that hums and rattles and spits lint into the air. The foreman is a man with a clipboard and a watch on a chain. He greets the guards, shakes the hand of the black sergeant, the same way he shakes the hand of the white corporal, and then turns to his machines. The guards fan the prisoners into 2 lines to unload bales from a wagon. The work is simple and hard. Karl feels the strap bite his palm and then ease when the bale settles. He settles into a rhythm, breath, lift, step, drop. He notices the way the black sergeant watches the line and catches small troubles a second before they become large. A man stumbles. The sergeant is there, takes his shoulder, sets him straight, and keeps the line moving. At noon, the foreman offers a water break under an elm and sets out a bucket with ladles. The guards drink last. The sergeant waits, then drinks, then nods. In that hour, Karl feels a calm that is not quite comfort and not yet trust. He is still inside the rules of war. He is watched and he is controlled, but he is not beaten and he is not hungry. He sees that the man who gives orders has earned the habit of being obeyed, and that the column obeys because it must. What happens on the way back from the field is the first true shock. The truck rattles through the center of a small town. There is a cafe with 2 windows open to the street, and the smell of coffee and fried onions in the air. The driver pulls over because a man from the gin has passed a message that the owner will sell sandwiches to the prisoners at the side door. The white driver hops down and goes to arrange it. The black sergeant checks the street, checks his watch, and then tells his corporal to keep the prisoners seated and quiet. The owner points to a side window and passes paper sacks through the opening. He counts. He takes the money from the driver. He hands the brown bags one by one. The prisoners open the sacks and find meat and bread and sliced tomato and a wedge of dill pickle. They eat with the speed of men who know the value of salt and fat after a day in sun. While they eat, 2 African-American soldiers from another unit walk up the sidewalk. Their uniforms are clean and their boots shine. They ask for coffee at the front door. The owner steps out and blocks the way. He says that he does not serve colored men inside. He says he will pass cups at the back. The soldiers look past him and see German prisoners eating lean against the truck within reach of the same kitchen. One of the soldiers says quietly that he is a soldier of the United States, that he wears the same flag as the men the owner served, that he has a right to a cup at the counter. The owner says the rule is the rule. The black sergeant on the truck steps down and stands beside the two men. He does not take his men into a fight that is not his to win today. He says they will take the coffee at the back and keep moving. The two men accept paper cups through the rear door. They stand in the alley and drink. The prisoners watch and hold their sandwiches and do not speak. That night, in the barracks, Karl puts words on the gray paper he uses for letters when the censors allow him to write. He writes that he is confused and ashamed. He writes that the men who order him to lift and to march and to keep his place are not allowed to step through a door that swings open for him when he wears a P stenciled on his jacket. He writes that the camp is fair and the food is plentiful and the guards do not curse for sport, and that the town outside the wire has rules that are strange to a man raised inside another set of lies. He does not write the thought that keeps him awake in the second hour of night. He thinks that power in this place is a coat that you can wear in the morning and that someone else can take from you at the door of a cafe in the afternoon. He does not know what to call that, and so he copies a line in German from a Bible he has seen in the camp chapel and stops there. The documentary record from the same season confirms what he sees. The War Department knew that towns near camps often served German prisoners while turning away African American soldiers. Newspapers carried stories from Temple and Killeen and other Texas towns near the big training grounds. Letters sent to editors in 1943 and 1944 described scenes where men in field gray rode in the front of buses while black soldiers stood in the rear, or where waitresses poured coffee for prisoners at a table while black sergeants were told to leave by the side door. An officer at a camp in Mississippi wrote that the policy of local cafes created tension he could not explain to his men. He said that he could order prisoners to behave and he could punish his own men for a breach of discipline, but he could not order a civilian owner to change a rule that was legal under state law. The Pittsburgh Courier ran editorials that called it a moral scandal that a man taken in arms against the country could sit where a citizen in uniform could not. The Courier asked if the flag had two meanings. The Army responded with memoranda that urged commanders to guide prisoners to buy foods at windows and to keep them away from main rooms. But such guidance could not change local custom when the truck was on a public street. At the same time, there are scenes that show the other side of the scale. On the base within federal authority, African American soldiers could and did give orders to German prisoners, and those orders held the force of law. In the fields near Hearne, and in the sawmills around Lufkin, and in the canneries outside Houston, black corporals counted heads and signed receipts and carried keys that opened the locks on chains. They carried sidearms and had the right to draw and load them if a prisoner ran. In the hierarchy of the camp and the work site, they had more freedom than any prisoner, and that freedom was real. It meant they could leave the barracks at dusk and go to a club reserved for their unit. It meant they could board a bus and travel to a base theater to see a film on a Saturday night. It meant they were paid and could send money home. It also meant that when the bus crossed the city line and pulled to a stop outside a cafe on a public street, the same men could be refused a seat while the enemy in their custody could eat at a window with a napkin and a paper cup of coffee. The contradiction is not lost on the men who live inside it. A black private wrote to his mother that he could carry a rifle, guard 50 prisoners, and not be trusted with a glass of cold milk at a lunch counter in town. A German prisoner wrote that his line had turned its faces to the truck bed while their guards drank in an alley because it felt like the only decent way to look. Inside the camp, the Army tries to drain tension with routine. The days fill with predictable tasks. Reveille, roll call, detail sheets, truck manifests, noon counts, Evening counts, and lights out. The numbers themselves tell a story of scale. By early 1944, prisoner labor will contribute millions of man-days to farms and mills. By the summer of 1944, African-American soldiers in transportation units will move thousands of carloads of lumber and grain each week through the southern ports. The system is large, and the system works as a machine that tolerates small frictions without stopping. And those frictions include the sight of a black sergeant who can order a German veteran to lift a bale at 8 in the morning and who must take his coffee at a side door at noon. The next weeks settle into a rhythm that makes sense inside the wire, even when the world outside it does not. Karl wakes to the scrape of boots on the barrack floorboards and the slow chime of a bell near the gate. He folds the blanket with the same care he once used to fold a field coat in Africa, and he checks the small notebook hidden in his sock. He writes a line or two before roll call when there is time. His handwriting steadies as his diet steadies. He eats oatmeal that tastes of salt and a little sugar, and he eats eggs when the cartons arrive on time, and he drinks coffee that is strong enough to rattle the nerves of a man who has known chicory for years. Some days his detail goes no farther than the camp workshop, and he carries boards to a man who planes them for repairs. On other days, the truck rolls through the same town where the cafe sign still hangs bright and clean over a front door that he does not forget. The black sergeant who guards the column speaks to them in short phrases of German learned by use and repetition. He gives the same orders he gave in the cotton yard. Keep distance. Keep your hat on. Drink water. Lift with 2 men on the big piece. Do not touch the chain when it is moving. In a sawmill outside Bryan, the sound of the blade makes every thought thinner. But the sight of the sergeant leaning to shout a warning at a man who stands too close stays with Karl even after the work ends. The sergeant looks at a hand that has been nicked, and then looks at the mill foreman, and then sets his jaw in a way that needs no translation. By late afternoon, the truck rolls back through streets where the heat of the day has pushed men into the shade. On one corner, a group of black school children in pressed shirts wait with books under their arms. An American flag flutters from a pole on the schoolhouse roof. On another corner, a door to a club is marked for colored soldiers, and music slides out into the street in a thin thread of piano and horn. It sounds like a quick step, and it sounds like a promise. The prisoners are not allowed to step down for a time. Closer, listen. They ride past and breathe dust. Karl presses his chin to the top board of the truck side and watches a line of soldiers in dark uniforms on the sidewalk ahead. They are African American, and their boots shine and their belts are white with polish, and their rifles are held at the same angle. He sees one of them turn to look at the truck for a second, and then look away. The truck slows for a moment at the same cafe corner he knows too well. A white man comes out with a sack of bread for the owner to carry back inside. He glances at the truck, glances at the soldiers on the sidewalk, and disappears through the door he holds open with his hip. That night, the camp library is open, and a German-language newspaper printed inside the camp runs an article on democratic government and the way towns elect their council. A guard lets a few of the men stand near the fence to feel the last light and the small breeze that comes with it. In the lamplight of the yard, the black sergeant laughs at something the white corporal says and claps his shoulder. Karl studies that simple touch and writes later that it is the first time he has seen a white man slap a black man on the shoulder, as if no one else were watching, and as if there were nothing to explain. He adds that the laugh was short and easy. He does not know if this is common. He only knows he saw it. Across the country that autumn, the American war machine turns in a way that makes such scenes both more likely and more tense. By the end of 1943, hundreds of thousands of African American soldiers serve in uniform. They staff quartermaster depots, operate railheads, guard warehouses and bridges, lay track, build roads, drive trucks on night convoys, and fill the long lines of units whose daily work keeps the front fed. Their labor is measured in tonnage and in miles and in hours saved. In the ports of Hampton Roads and New Orleans, longshore units with black enlisted men load ships with crates that hold canned meat, field telephones, rubber tires, and dry milk. In inland depots, they stack drums of fuel and track small hills of ammunition in neat rows. In the military police companies near camps that hold prisoners, they write reports, march patrols, inventory weapons, and learn the exact language of regulations that tie American promises to the Geneva Convention. The War Department issues circulars that remind every camp commander that prisoners must be fed at a level equal to American troops in garrison, that they must have access to medical care, that they must be paid small wages for labor that is lawful under the treaty. It also confirms that the Army itself is segregated. On paper, a black corporal can carry a key that opens the chain on a German prisoner and can sign his name under a charge sheet that binds that prisoner to a penalty for disobedience that a court can uphold. On the same paper, the War Department prints orders that assign men to separate barracks and that fix the location of service clubs by race. In the towns that surround the posts, many laws and customs fix where a man can sit on a bus, where he can eat, which door he may use, and which water fountain bears a sign. The contradiction is visible to every set of eyes that rides past a cafe window, and it is discussed out loud in newspapers and in letters home. The Pittsburgh Courier gives it a name that fits in two letters, a V for victory abroad and a V for victory at home. Editors point to the sight of prisoners in field gray who drink coffee at a window, while black soldiers who guard them stand outside. The Courier prints testimonies more than once. It lists towns and dates, and it copies the words of owners and managers who say that their hands are tied by local rules. Other papers carry stories, too. Some push back and ask why war prisoners are allowed to buy at all. Some call any complaint about the treatment of soldiers at home a distraction. It is not a distraction for the men who stand in the sun in their uniforms. It is not a distraction for the men who sit in the truck bed with paper cups and a tightness behind the eyes. It becomes a pressure that the Army can ease inside the fence but cannot fully solve when a truck stops on a public street. In November, the field work changes with the season. The cotton gins slow and the sawmills take more men. The camp sends groups to rice warehouses near the Brazos, where sacks are stacked like bricks. And it sends groups to canneries outside Houston, where large kettles steam, and women with hair tied in cloth loop labels over cans of tomatoes that come down a moving belt. Carl is sent 3 times to the rice warehouse and twice to the cannery where the heat inside the building feels like a second summer. On one of those days, an accident with a hand truck pinches a man's foot and pins him to a pallet. The black sergeant takes charge at once. He leans the truck back, barks for 2 men, orders one to pull straight, orders another to lift the pallet 2 inches, and then slides the foot free with a twist of his wrist. He directs the cannery nurse to wash the scrape, and then he signs the form for a doctor at the camp hospital to check the man at evening sick call. A white foreman watches the work and nods his thanks. He speaks with the sergeant the way one foreman speaks with another foreman, plainly and without sideways glances. When the truck rolls back that evening, the route takes them past the same cafe, but the driver does not stop. In the alley behind the club for black soldiers, A group gathers near the rear door and passes paper cups down a line with good humor and patience. Someone has set a radio in the window, and a piano plays inside. The soldiers laugh at a joke that Karl cannot hear but can feel. He watches the sergeant accept his cup as if it is not an indignity, and he sees him take one step to the side to give the next man room. The prisoners look away because it still feels wrong to watch a man in uniform drink in an alley after guarding them fairly through a day of work. The next Sunday, a chaplain comes to the camp to preach to the guards in a service that the prisoners are allowed to observe at a distance if they wish. The chaplain is black and wears a cross on his collar, and reads from a gospel that speaks of charity shown without hope of return. His voice is clear and measured. He speaks about pride that breaks men, and about pride that holds men up, and about how a nation should know the difference. After the service, the chaplain speaks with the camp commandant, and then with the black sergeant, and shakes his hand for a long second, as if he knows the weight the man carries. Later that evening, a convoy of trucks arrives with new prisoners from a ship at Galveston. The guards on that convoy are mixed. Some are white. Some are black. The column is formed, and the key clicks at the gate, and the new men file in with eyes that dart and try to count the towers and the lines of wire and the lamps. The black sergeant directs the count and reads the numbers with a steady tone. Karl has learned enough of the rhythm of these days to see what remains constant. Inside the wire, the army enforces a set of rules with military precision, and the man who carries the rifle and the clipboard has authority he can use. Outside the wire, what a man wears on his sleeve does not always matter when he reaches for a doorknob. He writes that line in his notebook and feels that it will be true for a long time. The larger story of that winter and of the following year makes that line heavier. The army continues to use prisoner labor by the tens of thousands of man-days each week. Farms across the South and the Midwest ask for details to lift bales, dig ditches, pick fruit, cut pulpwood, and clear brush. Manufacturers ask for details to unload freight, sweep floors, sort scrap, and run simple machines under strict rules that keep prisoners away from any line that touches weapons. In Texas alone, the labor of prisoners adds to the harvest of cotton and rice and to the output of canneries that supply feeds and rations in large tins. The statistical tables are written in big numbers because the country is big. One camp can send 500 men per day on trucks to work sites. One warehouse can take 100 men for 3 shifts. One sawmill can ask for 50 men 6 days in a row. The ledger entries climb through the months. Letters home tell pieces of the cost of this work. And sometimes those letters make it to papers that are willing to print them. In early 1944, accounts from towns in Texas and in other southern states describe days when a cafe served coffee to prisoners and refused coffee inside to Black American soldiers. Some accounts name the county, some do not. The Army responds with orders that try to keep such scenes from repeating, by guiding purchases to windows and by asking convoys not to stop on main streets. But long distances and human appetites make clean lines hard to hold. At the same time, there are scenes where the authority of black soldiers is real and felt. When an escape attempt is made near a cotton field outside Waco, it is a black corporal who raises his voice first, who warns once, who pursues on foot, and who calls for the truck to circle and cut the field road. The prisoner is caught within minutes and is returned without injury. The report entry lists the corporal by name and notes that he followed regulation and that he showed judgment. The number of escape attempts across the entire system will total a little more than 2,000 by the end of the war, and very few will result in a prisoner who remains at large. This does not change the fact that in many towns the same corporal cannot sit at a counter to buy a cup of coffee. The country will continue to hold these facts side by side. The war overseas will press on as well. In January 1944, the Allied armies fight in Italy at the Rapido and edge forward with cost. In June 1944, the landings in Normandy open a new front, and the cranes at American ports begin to move even faster. The same transportation units with black enlisted men move boxcars in long lines, and the same military police company near Camp Hearne adds night patrols as trains move through the dark more often. In July, an explosion at a naval magazine in California kills a large number of men, most of them black sailors who were loading ammunition. The story reaches paper in fragments and is a stark measure of risk. It feeds a current of anger that sits behind the daily patience of men who continue to do their work because the work must be done if the war is to be won. In the camp, German prisoners learn pieces of these stories from newspapers and from the look on a guard's face and from the way men speak through the fence at the end of a shift. They also learn that their own status is stable. They will be fed and paid in small script and allowed letters and allowed to study. They will be watched by men who are sometimes young and often tired, and who are sometimes not allowed to walk through a door that many prisoners are allowed to walk past with a sandwich in hand. One afternoon in December, a rain that has been promised for days finally falls, and the fields turn to clay and the roads slick to a shine. The work detail that day is to load scrap wood at a mill and stack it near a rail siding. The line goes slower when boards are wet and when hands go numb. The black sergeant does not speed the pace beyond what is safe, and he speaks often and with more German than he used in September when the first days were new. He is a better teacher now, and the prisoners are better students. When the shift ends, the truck is late because a bus has skidded at a corner. The men wait under the mill eave with sawdust under their boots. The foreman has set a barrel with a little fire near the door, and the guards stand beside it. A white deputy from the county comes by in a car with a star painted on the door and asks what is happening. He looks at the prisoners. He looks at the guards. He rests his eyes on the sergeant and asks if the men have been any trouble. The sergeant answers that there has been no trouble and that they will be gone as soon as the truck arrives. The deputy nods and says to keep them away from the main street on the way out. The sergeant says he will follow the route he has been given. It is spoken like a rule, and the deputy lets it stand. The truck groans into view, and the prisoners climb aboard. They ride back through the same street that is thinly lit now with rain, slick light, and pale signs. The cafe door stands open, but no one steps out to offer bags today. The truck passes the club in the alley, where the piano plays a slow song that sounds like a promise kept in a quiet room. The sergeant looks at the door for a second, and then looks away because he is on the clock, and because there is a line of men on the truck bed who must be counted and returned. In the barracks that night, Karl writes on a piece of paper that he has dried against his leg. He writes that he now understands the rule that truly governs him here. He is under the authority of the United States, and he is under the authority of a man who is fair and firm and sometimes kind, and that man is not free to walk through every door he has earned. He writes that this is a hard rule to accept, and that he feels complicit in it every time he eats near a window. He stops and rubs his eyes and then adds that the man with the rifle treats him as a man. He writes that without poetry because he does not want to write poetry. He wants to write what he saw and what the numbers tell, and to let the rest stand without a flourish. He remembers a line that the chaplain said about the burden that comes with strength, and he wonders if that man carries a burden that has a color and a weight and a place in the body where it sits. He closes the notebook, blows out the candle, and sleeps. The winter turns, and by January 1944, the cold in the Texas morning settles like a film over the yard before the sun lifts it, and Karl learns to read the day by the sounds that come through the thin walls of the barrack before reveille. He hears the cluck of the stove door, the scrape of a broom, the cough of a man who still holds desert dust in his chest, and the distant ring of a bell from the gatehouse that marks the hour with a discipline that is hard and fair. He ties his boots with fingers that have grown calluses from rough lumber and sackcloth. He checks the paper he hides in his sock and writes 3 words that say only that the night was quiet. On many mornings his detail forms with a familiar rhythm, and the black sergeant who has watched him since the first week reads the names with careful vowels. It is a habit now to catch the small nod that meets his own surname, a mark of recognition that is not friendship and is not contempt. The truck rolls out, after count, and bumps along the same route where the town wakes at a measured pace, where men in work coats fold newspapers under their arms, and women sweep the stoops of small stores whose windows already glow with electric light. The same cafe door stands open, and the same smell of coffee drifts out. And the memory of the first day they stopped there is a weight that every prisoner on the benches can feel, though no one speaks of it. On good days, the route takes them past the rail siding, where freight cars stand in lines that seem to have no end. And at the far edge of the yard there is a low shed where African-American soldiers from a transportation company move crates with a speed that matches the steady beat of their own shouted counts. Karl watches the pattern for a full minute every time the driver slows for a crossing. There is a rhythm to the work that is almost beautiful. Men and crates, rope and wheel, iron and plank, with commands that are short and certain and do not waste breath. He has begun to notice that the black sergeant who rides with his detail shares that same economy of motion, that same way of saving strength for the tasks that matter. At noon, the cannery steam can close over a man like a second coat and make the skin slick and the breath shorter. The nurse in the first aid cubicle checks a cut and shakes her head in approval at the clean line. The sergeant signs the little paper and hands it back, then turns to the foreman with a direct look that needs no translation. The routine is a comfort inside the wire and around these buildings, because it is predictable, and because the rules are written, and because the men who enforce them follow them in public view. The moment that breaks the calm comes late one Saturday, when the truck slows near the same corner, and the driver says something to the corporal about a quick stop for sandwiches, and the sergeant says quietly that there will be no stop on the main street today. The driver shrugs, then nods, and keeps rolling. Karl hears only that short exchange, but it is enough to tell him that a line has been drawn by a man who has weighed the cost of repeating an old insult against the value of a cup of hot coffee on a cold day. In the camp that evening, the library opens, and men gather around a newsreel projector in the recreation hall, where a film from the Signal Corps shows maps of Italy and hard slopes and rivers with names that are difficult for German tongues to shape. The narrator speaks of Anzio and of supply lines and of ports where cranes swing day and night. There is a brief scene of American dock workers loading ammunition, and the camera lingers for a second on a line of black sailors who pass heavy shells by hand from stack to stack. The room is silent as the frames flicker. Afterward, in a far corner, someone mentions a story that has come through from the coast about a magazine explosion months away in California that will later be called a calamity. The details are not yet clear in Karl's world, but the hint is enough. The next morning, a chaplain in a crisp uniform preaches on the base and reads a short line about men who do their duty when no one is watching. The black sergeant stands near the back, hat in hand, and listens with stillness that is almost prayer. And when he leaves, he steps aside to let a white lieutenant pass through a narrow door. The lieutenant nods, and the sergeant nods back. It is a small exchange, but it sits in Karl's mind like a clear bell tone that lingers a long while, because it is simple and because it is rare on the streets outside. Across the national map, the facts of that winter are recorded in figures that grow with the speed of a country at war. By early 1944, the number of German prisoners in the United States has moved well above 200,000 and will continue to climb until the peak the next year. Camps in Texas hold many thousands, with large facilities at Hearne and Huntsville, and several branch camps scattered near mill towns and farms. The Army measures prisoner labor not by anecdote, but by ledgers that list man-days delivered to growers and to plants, and the sums reach into the millions. The Geneva Convention provisions require pay for work within the allowed categories, and the script coupons that pass through prisoner hands add up to large totals that are spent on small comforts and on stamps for letters home. At the same time, the role of African American soldiers expands and becomes even more visible. The Army counts more than 700,000 black men in uniform by mid-1944 and keeps assigning them to the long chain of labor that makes every front possible. Transportation corps companies with black enlisted men load cargo at Hampton Roads, New York, and New Orleans, and move it through inland depots where cars are spotted and switched to match timetables that are precise to the minute. Engineer units build roads and lay track with ties measured by the mile. Military police companies guard depots and camps and convoys and enforce the regulations that keep the prisoner system from becoming a riot of small abuses. There are well-known controversies as well. In July 1944, a terrible explosion at a naval magazine at Port Chicago kills hundreds of men, most of them black sailors, and the story radiates outward through letters and through newspapers, and the meanings reach even into the quiet corners of inland camps, where guards shake their heads and talk about risk and about fairness. The Pittsburgh Courier continues to print reports that describe scenes like the one Karl has already witnessed, where prisoners can buy at a window and black soldiers are told to step to the rear door. The Courier's Double Vi campaign asks its readers to hold two ideas at once: that victory in Europe and the Pacific requires unity, and that victory at home requires a new honesty about the way these soldiers live inside the country they serve. Commanders receive circulars that tell them to avoid Main Street purchases with prisoner details and to instruct drivers to use windows, but no circular can rewrite local law in a day. In August, a supply route in France that will be famous for speed will run for months, with trucks driven mostly by black soldiers who cover hundreds of miles each day on poor roads under constant pressure to make time, and the name of that route will be known for years. News of such feats returns to the States through stories passed hand to hand. Yet for many of the men on guard duty at inland camps, the most immediate theater remains a cafe door or a bus seat only a few miles from their own barracks. The contradiction is held in the same hands that tighten a strap on a truck bed, and in the same voices that call a count or a warning on a loading dock. It is written in a morning report that lists prisoners by number and guards by name and says more between the lines than any clerk could capture. The season of wheat and then the heat of early summer arrive, and the work shifts to fields where combines move with a slow authority that makes their progress feel like the turn of a clock. Karl rides past section after section of grain that lifts and falls in the hot wind like a slow sea, and he thinks about the numbers that the foreman said without thinking when he bragged to the guard about yields per acre that would double anything his father had seen in Silesia. The truck smells of chaff and of sweat, and of the mild oil on the sergeant's rifle. One day, a farmer's wife hands the sergeant a paper sack with apples and says it is for the men on the truck. The sergeant divides the fruit with careful fairness and keeps none for himself until the last man has taken a piece. Karl bites into a sweet that tastes like a memory of a kitchen that feels far away. In town, the contrasts remain fixed. On another afternoon, the driver again speaks of stopping for sandwiches, and the sergeant again shakes his head with that same quiet authority that carried the day before. This time, the owner has come out to the curb with a tray because a deal has been made between a foreman and a driver who know each other from the route. The owner places the tray on the curb, and the driver takes it to the truck bed, and the prisoners eat without leaving their bench. As they eat, 2 black soldiers from another unit arrive and stand at the cafe door. They wait without knocking. They know the rule. A bus pulls to the curb, and a group of civilians steps down with parcels. The owner allows them to pass, and then turns the sign in the window that reads "closed" for a few minutes, and pulls the door gently shut. The black soldiers move to the alley without a word. The sergeant does not move from his place by the truck wheel. He does not speak until the driver returns the tray, and then he says only that the route must not stop here again. That night, the camp theater shows a film with news scenes from Europe. Karl watches a map of France light, with arrows and dots, and hears numbers about ships and planes and men that leave him breathless. He thinks of the trucks he has begun to hear about, the ones that run without sleep in a country across the ocean, and the fact that many of their drivers are men who could not walk through a door in this town. He writes this in his notebook with one hard line that he presses so firmly that the pencil tip snaps. He rewrites it and underlines it with care. A week later, a chaplain returns and speaks in a smaller room with a group of guards and a few prisoners who stand respectfully at the edge. He quotes a letter from a mother in Illinois who writes about her son who will be shipped west for guard duty and who tells him to be good to the men he watches because it is right and because it helps bring the war to a close. The black sergeant listens with that same stillness, and later on the yard he stops Karl for the first time not to give an order, but to ask a question, whether the men in the barrack are keeping the stove clean. Karl answers yes with a reflex that has become a habit. The sergeant nods and says good. It is the smallest human exchange, and it carries a strange weight, because it is free of the guard and prisoner ritual for 1 second. The next morning they are back in their roles, and the truck rolls out at dawn. The record of that summer and of the months that follow sets these personal scenes against events that mark the progress of the war and the stubborn pace of change at home. In June and July, the fronts in Europe demand more supplies every day, and the numbers that describe American production are measured in millions of tons and in tens of thousands of vehicles, and in rivers of fuel that must reach a front through new ports and over bombed rail lines. In August, the truck route in France that has already begun to make its name keeps moving with an intensity that seems impossible until one reads the logbooks and sees the distances and the repetition. The men who drive on those roads write letters home that speak of bad weather and long hours and pride in the work. And many of those drivers are black soldiers who will return to towns where a cafe door will still be shut in their faces. In Italy, units with black soldiers in combat roles fight in mountain valleys and on ridges where stone has known war for centuries. Their casualty lists appear in the small type of home papers and say in a plain way that the cost spreads across every neighborhood. In the United States, the camps reached their largest populations in the spring of 1945, and the number of escape attempts remains small compared with the total, and most attempts end within hours. When prisoners are moved for labor, they are guarded by men like the sergeant the reader has come to know, and the reports note again and again that the days pass without incident because the rules are clear and because the men with authority act with competence. Editors continue to argue in print about the treatment of prisoners and of black soldiers in the same towns, and a few owners change their policies for fear of bad publicity or in response to quiet pressure from post commanders who do not want drama near their gates. Many owners do not change. In December of 1944, the war in Europe surges again with a German attack in the snow that catches many by surprise and burns through supplies at a rate that tests the very limits of the system. The trucks in France run harder. The trains in the south move more freight to ports for replacement stocks. The guards at inland camps work extra hours because the movement of prisoners quickens when men are shipped home to Europe for exchange or moved to other districts. The black sergeant near Hearne works his patrols and his counts and his reports with the same steady hand. His authority remains complete inside the fence and inside the rules of his work. It remains incomplete on the sidewalks a few miles away. That truth will not change in his lifetime as quickly as he might hope, though the war has already planted seeds he cannot yet see, and the sight of a prisoner line that looks away when he is sent to the rear door is one of those seeds. The diaries of German prisoners record that they were troubled by what they had seen, and that trouble did not leave them when they returned to a Europe that would need to learn again what fairness means. Karl's own notebook for the fall of 1944 holds a sentence that he copies twice. He writes that the man who guards him has more power than he does and less freedom than he deserves, and that both facts can be true at the same time, and that this country will have to decide what it wants those facts to say about itself. He does not need a newspaper to understand the weight of that sentence. He has lived it at the back of a truck, beside a field, and outside a door that opens for a prisoner while a soldier in the same uniform waits in an alley for a paper cup of coffee and does not complain, because he has a shift to finish and a column to count and a report to sign at dusk. By the first months of 1945, the war in Europe nears its peak, and the world outside Camp Hearne shifts faster than news can travel through its fences. Each bulletin that arrives from the Army's Public Information Office is read aloud in the mess hall, followed by long silences that carry the weight of both relief and unease. The men hear that American forces have crossed the Rhine, that British bombers have flattened cities whose names many prisoners once called home, and that Allied troops have entered camps in Poland and seen things that make even the hardest hearts fall quiet. Karl listens to the announcements in measured disbelief, trying to match each headline to a face he once knew. When the room empties, he stands for a moment near the bulletin board where tattered newspapers hang under glass, and his eyes fall on a smaller article reprinted from a Texas paper. It reports that black American soldiers in Europe are now serving in combat in newly formed platoons of white infantry divisions. The article is brief, written in neutral tone, but the meaning sits like a stone in Karl's chest. He remembers the sergeant at the gate, the man who carried his rifle with calm pride, and wonders if he has heard the same news, and what it might mean to him to see men like himself finally recognized on foreign soil even while the same towns here still close their doors. Work continues because war does not end in one breath. The fields near Hearne have dried again, and the trucks roll out with the same cough of engines that have survived 2 winters. Karl rides in the same corner of the bench, his back to the sideboard, his knees braced against the vibration. The sergeant's routine never changes. He checks the rifle chamber each morning with the same clean motion, then rests it across his knees for the long ride. His voice carries through the dust as he calls out commands, short, direct, stripped of anything but purpose. When they stop at a new site, a lumberyard near College Station, the foreman hesitates at first when he sees who leads the escort. He greets the white corporal first, then pauses before the sergeant, uncertain whether to offer a hand. The sergeant breaks the silence himself and extends his own, and the foreman shakes it because the rules of the army carry weight even on a civilian lot. Karl watches the exchange and sees in it a quiet lesson. There is power in simple discipline, in doing a job so cleanly that no one can deny its worth. By noon, sawdust covers the prisoners' boots, and the heat inside the sheds makes breathing hard. The sergeant walks the line, checking on each man with quick eyes, and when one of the younger prisoners drops a plank too soon and splits his thumb, the sergeant binds it with gauze himself. No speeches, no cruelty, just efficiency. When they ride back to camp that evening, the truck stops once near a general store so the driver can collect mail. The store window bears a sign that reads, "Whites only," hand-painted but fresh. The sergeant stands a few feet away and looks straight ahead, expression still. Karl studies him from the truck bed, not with pity, but with growing comprehension. For the first time, he feels shame not as a prisoner of war, but as a man who has watched injustice and can name it.